Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book entitled Revolutionary Summer, which details the first half of 1776, when events crucial to the American Revolution took place. The book's author is Professor Joseph Ellis, one of the great historians of our day and an acknowledged master of the Revolutionary period. He has written, among other works, leading, much honored, often prize-winning books about Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. And most recently, he detailed the events of the spring and summer of 1776 in the book we shall discuss today. And I may add that he is working on a book that will discuss the Constitutional Convention and how those matters dealing with the Constitution came to pass. Professor Ellis, who I am pleased to say is a trustee of both the Massachusetts School of Law and American College of History and Legal Studies, is of course with me today to discuss his book entitled Revolutionary Summer. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Joe, again, thank you for coming. This is, I believe, your third appearance here.
It's a pleasure to be back with you again, Larry.
Thank you. I think you were my very first interview, maybe 175 or 180 interviews
More
ago.
like 12 years ago, I think it was. It was a book called Founding Brothers, which did very well, and part of the reason was because the airing of the program you did. You prepare these interviews more than anybody I know of, and I've been interviewed by a lot of people. The degree of preparation you do is remarkable, and so let's get going.
Well, thank you very much, and yes, okay. First of all, when we were speaking in my office just before we started taping, you launched into this absolutely fascinating soliloquy, if I may call it that. About
I hope it wasn't a lecture.
No, it was fascinating. It's not every day that I don't interrupt somebody in the middle, you know. And about how you came to write this book and what you thought about the events that led to your writing the book. And I'd like to ask you to simply discuss for the audience how you came to write this book and what you thought about those events and anything else that's a part of that story. And if you take 10 or 15 minutes, I won't interrupt.
I won't take that long. But the way I go about it when I'm looking for the next assignment, if you will, as a writer and historian, is to ask myself, well, what is the story you want to tell? Not really what is the person you want to study or what is the question you want to address. It's what's the story you want to tell. And I spent about 6 months investigating the coming of independence on the hunch that there were some new things to say and different ways to look at that very historic moment. And I discovered that there were such things, and that most of the work done on the coming of independence focuses on the political story and on the Continental Congress and Jefferson's draft and Adams in the play 1776. 1776 takes some historical liberties, but it's still the way in which a lot of Americans come to know the story. There's also simultaneously going on down in New York, on Long Island and Manhattan, an invasion. The British are invading the American colonies, and Washington's the main figure down there, and the Continental Army is the main focus of that story. And what I came to understand is that those two stories, which are told separately, are really one story, and you have to put them together, and they interact. And that in one very crucial respect, it's the invasion that galvanizes American popular opinion for independence, which up until 6 months, 5 months before didn't exist. There was divisions, and there was a set of assumptions on both sides that we were going to find a diplomatic way out of this thing. And it was clear, and we'll talk about what this could have been, it was clear there was a way out. But that in May of 1776, Adams wrote a resolution on behalf of the Continental Congress sent to all the governors of the respective colonies, asking them to rewrite their colonial charters or constitutions as state constitutions. Now, if you're going to do that, that means you're ready for independence, obviously. It's a de facto referendum. on independence. Each of these governors sent it to the legislature sent it out to the towns and counties in each colony. In Massachusetts, for example, they sent it to 46 towns. Guess what? We have the response for all 46 towns and the rest of the colony, or the counties in, say, Virginia as well. They all say the same thing. By the way, this is buried in a mid-19th century collection of documents called American Archives. They say, 6 months or so ago, we could not have believed that we were reaching this conclusion because we regarded George III as our paternal figure, our friend, and though we were opposed to Parliament's authority, we thought he was with us and would protect us. Now, with this invasion, it's clear that's not true. And in truth, we have no decision to make, that he has declared independence of us. And there's no discussion of constitutional issues. That's, once you militarize the conflict, it moves to a different kind of political chemistry. And they have no choice. And so the book represents an attempt to tell that kind of story. And no event in American history which looks as inevitable in retrospect was more improbable at the time. And I want to catch that improbability and give readers a sense to recover what it looked, smelt, and felt like for the people participating.
A fantastic read. Joe, why don't historians connect the political and the military sides? You know, I find this remarkable because, I mean, my own experience includes Vietnam, and I can't imagine thinking about Vietnam without thinking about what was happening domestically in the United States. And from what I read, I think much the same is true of the two world wars and Korea. And so I find it remarkable that historians have bifurcated the two things. Well, why do you think they've done that, and so that it was left to you to realize they have to be connected?
I don't know the answer to that, in the sense that it seemed obvious to me, to use Jeffersonian language, self-evident, that, that these things were interacting and you had to know both sides of this same story. Part of it has to do with political historians are not interested in military history, and military historians become specialists in battles and that kind of thing. So part of it is a reflection of specialization within the discipline. I think the political story is so hegemonic in the secondary literature, meaning that's what most people know about. And it has a kind of iconic aura to it. And the play 1776 and the Adams HBO miniseries that appeared recently builds on that. So it's in people's minds, and that's what those are the images and the issues that seem to want to dominate. And so if you go down to New York and look at the military side, what are we doing down here? You know, I mean, and though as McCulloch did write a book called 1776 in which he focused exclusively on the military side of the story. And
but that's more of the same in a certain
yeah,
sense.
the real truth of the matter, though, from a purely scholarly point of view, is that most American historians aren't asking either one of those questions right now. That is, they're not asking the political question, they're not asking the military question. They're off pursuing other prey, and they're moseying on down different trails. They're searching for the Native American experience during this period. They're searching for the history of women. They're searching, in Jill Lepore's wonderful phrase, to give voice to the voiceless. And a recent book on Jane Franklin. They're interested in the importance of the ordinary. I'm interested in the importance of the extraordinary. And they say the periphery is the center. I say the center is the center. And that I'm interested in events that actually shape the values and the institutions that we continue to live under. And but I'm somewhat unusual in this regard. And I don't begrudge them what they're doing, that, you know, that let 1,000 flowers bloom. But the fact of the matter is the profession is tending off in a different direction.
Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about why the British Army and Navy were regarded as so all-powerful? And related to it, I think, inevitably, is why the Revolution was, in a sense, the precursor to Vietnam, because the British faced problems that we only began to understand their problems when we faced the same ones in Nam.
You're right on the latter point. I completely agree that my own understanding of the British dilemma in the Revolution is very much a product of the experience of Vietnam and America's experience there. And America was just an emerging world power at that time in the 60s. Britain was an emerging world power in the 1770s. But the British Army, especially when compared to, say, the Continental Army, the average experience of the soldier in the British Army was 7.5 years. The average experience for a field grade officer was 20 years. The British Army had been put together over a 150-year period of time. It takes a long time to create an army. You can't do it de novo. I mean, where do you put the commissary? Where do you put the quartermaster? Where do you put the latrines? What are the promotion rates? What are the relationship between artillery and infantry? There is also a British aristocracy that goes into the Army. Both the Howe brothers, who were the commanders of the Army and the Navy in the invasion of New York, both went to Eton. Both were aristocrats. One was a member of the House of Lords, the other is a member of the House of Commons. So there's a tradition of members of the British elite becoming officers in the Army or the Navy. And what makes the British Army by itself was probably as good as the French Army, but no better, and not quite as good as the Prussian Army.
Really?
Yeah. But you put the British Army and the Navy together, and they're numero uno because of the prowess of the British Navy. And in the war, one of the things that I noticed is the British the British never win when they're inland. When they're inland, like Saratoga, they get surrounded. So they have to fight either on rivers or on the coastline. But the American Army is comprised of people whose average experience is 6 months. Some of Washington's eventually most talented officers, people he's handpicked, are having to learn on the job. Nathaniel Greene becomes his most trusted lieutenant. He's a general Quaker from Providence, Rhode Island, never fired a shot in anger, never had any experience. One day he's a private, the next day he's a general. Henry Knox, former bookseller in Cambridge, read about war, 300 pounds, looks like Santa Claus. He becomes a great artillery officer. But New York is like a hands-on experiment for them. And the militia, which are, there's a kind of balloon theory in the American strategic thinking, like we'll have this corps of regulars, and then in any given battle, all the local militia will show up. But like, if you think about it, what are they supposed to do? I mean, they don't have the same weapons, they don't have the same, you can't, there's no interchangeable weaponry. Most of them are worthless in conventional battles, and they all run away. So the myth of the militia is a myth. I mean, itself a myth.
Yeah.
Now, there are a couple occasions where that doesn't happen. Saratoga is one of them, but Lexington and Concord is an earlier one. But I think that the American Army is no match for the British Army and Navy in any conventional battle. And that is one of the things they discover in Long Island and Manhattan. There is a problem, too, that the Americans have that is Washington's major problem at this stage. I mean, his major problem, he's got this inferior force. which he projects as himself, and in other words, he's totally invested in this. He harbors an honor-driven sense of battle. If the enemy appears, I am honor-bound to meet him. It's like a summons to duel. A gentleman cannot reject that. So if William Howe presents his army on Long Island, I must meet him square on. This is a suicidal strategic idea. And he should have been thinking, the last thing I want to do is defend New York. New York is an archipelago. Whoever controls the sea controls the battle. You're outnumbered 42,000 to 28,000. You're outgunned because they can move artillery on the ships around. The thing to have done was take him inland to New Jersey or Connecticut, avoid the battle. He didn't think he had the right to do that because the Continental Congress had told him to defend New York, and civilian superiority over military is something he really believed in. But one of the consequences of the defeat in Long Island and Manhattan in the late summer of '76 is that Washington's thought process starts to change. He begins to understand that this honor-driven sense of battle is not a good idea, and that he needs to avoid conflict whenever he doesn't have a tactical superiority and an exit strategy. Because, and this is a profound, though obvious in retrospect, insight, the Americans don't have to win the war. The British have to win. And eventually, if you string it out, and they string it out for 7.5 years, they're going to simply say, it's not worth it anymore, and leave. It's our country. And that's what happens. And Washington begins to fight what they call a war of posts. It's not quite a guerrilla war because he's got a conventional army, but he's avoiding conflict whenever possible, and unless he has superiority. He makes a couple mistakes in Germantown, he does. But anyway, the reason we win the war is because Washington decides we don't try to win it. We try not to lose it. And if you think about it, in history, many of the great generals are losers. Hannibal's a loser. Napoleon's a loser. Robert E. Lee's a loser. Rommel's a loser. Washington lost almost every big battle, but he won the war. And it's the lessons he learns in this first couple months of the war that makes that possible, I think.
Yeah. So in effect, like the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, we outlasted them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Like, there's a meeting after the Battle of Long Island, before the battles at Kips Bay and on Manhattan. The British naval commander, Richard Howe, Admiral Howe, requests a meeting with a delegation from the Continental Congress. His intention is to say to them, look, you just had the stuffings kicked out of you on Long Island. We've got 1,000 prisoners. You've suffered 1,000 casualties. We've suffered like 10. There's no way you can win. Cannot we negotiate now? Well, they send 3 people, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and a South Carolinian called Rutledge. And Franklin knows Howe from London, and they worked together because Howe was opposed to this militarization policy. He thought this war was a mistake. So, by the way, did Jeffrey Amherst, and refused to command the British Army. And I won't fight the Americans, he said. And so Howe makes this little presentation, and Franklin sort of turns the tables on him and says, well, Sir Richard, the truth is you can't win. You're telling us we can't win. I'm telling you you can't win. Adams chimes in to say that's correct. And if you're telling us that you have the capacity to destroy the Continental Army here, and If you do, we'll just raise another army. We'll find another Washington. Franklin says, it's interesting, he says, this will be looked upon in British history as the Crusades. And your reputation will suffer.
Yeah, yeah.
So I advise you to take all your ships and just go back now. What you want us to do is turn back the clock. We've declared independence. We can't redo that. And so in fact, they landed on Long Island on July 2nd,
Right.
which was the day
Right.
the forward edge of the fleet did. That's the day they voted for independence.
Right.
It could have gone if a couple days differently. I'm not sure, you know, because the Howe brothers had an offer to make. Whether they had the real power and authority to make the offer is very questionable. But it gets back to what could have been a diplomatic resolution of this before it got militarized by George III. Probably the biggest blunder in the history of British statecraft, by the way. And it was clear what could have happened, what should have happened if the war was to be avoided.
What was that resolution, Joe?
We, British government, recognize the right of the colonial legislatures to tax themselves, to raise revenue. You recognize the authority of the king, and you remain within the empire, allowing the Navigation Acts to stay in place because we're both beneficiaries of that.
Those are trade acts.
Yeah. In effect, it would have been a discovery of the British Commonwealth 100 years earlier.
Yeah.
William Pitt, Edmund Burke, both argued in favor of this in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. These are two big names.
Yeah.
John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson sent a resolution to George III arguing for this. It turns out George III never read it. They were committed to not a diplomatic resolution. Why? This is the question that I try to like. It's so obvious that the answer is threefold. First, the great jurist Blackstone had 10 years earlier written a famous treatise in which he said, in every government and in every empire, there has to be a single source of final authority. One source, a final place where ultimate decisions reside or are made. And in the British government, that is Parliament. It's actually the Parliament and the King together. Therefore, the colonial position, which is that there'll be multiple sovereignties, which each of these colonies and legislatures sovereign, is like saying there's many gods rather than one. So that's not going to work, even though, of course, now we have multiple sovereignties in the country. Second reason, you mentioned Vietnam, an early version of the domino theory. If we do this, what happens in Canada? What happens in Ireland? What happens in Scotland? What happens in India? We will be sending a signal of weakness that will undermine our authority in those other places, and we're not going to do it. Third.
Before you get to the third,
yeah,
let me ask you something about that second one.
Okay.
I find that kind of the continuation into our own time of that kind of thinking to be purely remarkable, because it has so often been indulged, and I don't know if it's fair to say has always been wrong, but certainly has been wrong many times and in extremely consequential ways. How does thinking like this continue? To lose is not the end of the world. I mean, there was the Vince Lombardi.
Famous theologian in the middle of the 20th century. He wrote a book about this called The Irony of American History. What he said is all imperial powers, and America is just emerging as the imperial power in the midst of a new emerging Cold War in the 1950s, come to believe that they are omnipotent. And the truth is, nobody can police the world. It's a suicidal mission. Nobody has the resources to do that. It is not controllable. You can't control history. in the way that you begin to think you can. And so what the United States has done since 1945 and is beginning to have second thoughts about because of the travesties in the Middle East is in accord with what every imperial power always does. And there's a great book on this called The Rise and Fall of the World Powers by, what's his name, Kennedy. And they all do the same thing. They emerge because of their economic power. They overextend themselves because of their hubris. And that overextension erodes their economic power, and they're replaced by somebody else. And so that's a pattern that again, as you were saying, once you're aware of that pattern, it should have some effect on the decision to foreign policy decisions and the national security decisions we make. But that my other answer is that once you create a huge military complex, it generates its own missions. I mean, we have the largest military force on the planet. Next 14 or 20 countries combined don't spend as much as we do. If there was a place to save money in the budget, that would be it. But you can't touch it because of congressional voting patterns. And like, remember after the Cold War ended, we were going to have this peace dividend. Remember that?
Oh, yes.
Well, what happens then is 9/11. Okay, and we use 9/11 to justify this incredible further expansion of military power. So that if you look at the pattern, they're always going to find something. I know this sounds terribly leftist, but it's not. It's historically the way it happens. I mean, in retrospect, as traumatic as 9/11 was, the worst thing we could possibly have done, it's what Osama bin Laden couldn't have helped for better than for us to invade Iraq. Now, we're pretty far from the 18th century here, and I'm sure you want to draw us back, but that we are looking in the summer of 1776 with a rising imperial power, Great Britain, making all the mistakes that we will ourselves make later on.
Yep.
This op-ed editor at the LA Times, her name is Susan, and she wanted me to do a piece on what would Washington say about Iraq.
Where's that?
And that's what he would have said. That's what he would have said. I don't even know where Iraq is. It doesn't exist. It doesn't get created until like 1921, yeah. I think. And I don't know what weapons of mass destruction are. I don't know what the Taliban is. I don't know any of that stuff. And so Susan says, "That's all fine, Joe, but just write the piece, okay?" So I wrote this piece in which I basically said, if you show Washington Iraq, he would say, "I'm totally confounded because we have become the British." And that would be impossible for him to understand. And it made me think, well, if you ask most Americans whether we are an imperial power, an empire, 95% of them will say no. If you ask everybody else in the world, 99% of them will say yes. So we are really an empire in denial. Why are we in denial? Because we know in our hearts that it's running against the core of our historical experience. That is, we began as the first anti-imperial power in the modern era, winning a successful war for colonial independence. Our deepest roots are anti-imperial, and it takes isolationist forms in other venues, but that one of the reasons we don't do this very well is because I don't really believe it. Again, that's the way in which my own thinking about the 18th century has, pretty much like yours, been shaped by what's happening in the 20th and 21st century.
For 25 years, the Massachusetts School of Law has been training great lawyers and building great relationships.
Joining MSL was more than just making friends. It was becoming a part of a family, which makes it very difficult to leave.
I don't want to leave MSL.
We didn't want to leave MSL ever! Best decision ever! We love MSL and we don't want to leave.
The Massachusetts School of Law. Great lawyers, better people. Come join our family. Visit us today at mslaw.edu.
It's remarkable, Joe, but what we're talking about here, what you're talking about here, is a continuous, unchanging pattern of thinking for hundreds and hundreds of years involving many leading international powers. And, you know, you look at it and you say, my God, it doesn't change, you know. Whereas we're supposed to be the masters of rationality, but you know, the statesmen, the politicians, the general guy in the street, it doesn't change.
Well, I think that, you know, there'll be people that say, well, of course it changes, and that, like, right now in the 21st century, America as the dominant world power cannot have colonies in the same way, let's say, the British had colonies, okay? That is not permissible. It has to be a more elliptical, or it's, what's the word? It's more indirect exercise of influence, hegemonic, not imperial. And so we have 88,000 troops in Germany, we have 40,000 in South Korea, and 30,000 in Okinawa and Japan. If you think about it, wherever we've won a war, we have troops. They never go away. They never. Now, the one place we don't have them is Vietnam, because we didn't win. But if we had won, we would have had 50,000 still there.
We should lose more wars.
Yeah, I think that. Adams had a funny line when he was being told that they were going to. And Adams, by 1776, 77, is the equivalent of the Secretary of War, because he's the head of the Board of War and Ordnance. And when they appoint him, he says, I know nothing about this. And his friends in Cambridge says, go into the Harvard Library and find all the books about how to organize an army. But when the British present him with this notion that they're going to lose all the battles, that Americans are going to lose all the battles, he said, that's great. We'd love to have you win in Philadelphia, then you have to occupy Philadelphia. And then you can win in other places, and you have to occupy there. And it's almost like he says, the Americans will lose their way to victory, because the more the territory that the British have to occupy and control, the more restrained it is on their supply system, and the more impossible the mission becomes. But he actually said that to him. And anyway, your original point, yeah, I'd say something silly here that I don't want to mean, and that is that the psychological forces at work here and the psychological and social forces at work are as old as Aristotle.
That's pretty much what I think. You know, I don't know what happened before the revolution, but from what I've seen in my life and what I've read, it seems to me there's a permanent continuum here, and it seems that nobody can get by it. Joe, there was one time, you say there was one time in the entire American Revolution that the British Army could have destroyed the American Army.
Yeah.
And possibly that would have ended the revolution, although, as I think you've said already, there were people like Adams who said, hey, we'll find another Washington, we'll find another army.
It's impossible to answer that question because you can't run the tape back.
That's right.
There are people that thought at the time that it would not have necessarily ended the war. But what's impossible to know is what the political impact that would have had, especially on people in the middle. Okay, we know that 19% of the American population was loyalist. A lot of them had gone by then, okay, not maybe half of them. Then that doesn't mean that 81% were loyal patriots, though. Maybe in New England it's pretty high like that. But in the middle colonies and the southern colonies, there's a lot of people who go with wherever the army is. The British are there, we're on your side. Now that doesn't work for them very well, because then when the British go away, the Americans come in and hang them or burn their houses down. But in the summer of '76, the Howe brothers have the Americans trapped on an archipelago. Now, all they really needed to do was go up to the Harlem River, plug it, establish their army there, and march south.
That'd be on Manhattan.
On Manhattan, and where are the Americans going to go? They got no place to go. The East River and the Hudson River, and eventually they'd trap them all on Long Island. They decide not to do that, and the Howe brothers don't want a genocidal war. They want a proportional war. They see themselves as part soldiers and part peace negotiators. We will come over and we will deliver some pretty tough blows. We'll, as William Howe says, rough them up, okay? And then after we do that, and they're sufficiently humbled, we're going to say, okay, let's end this nonsense now, because they really both think that this is a mistake for the British Empire and for the Americans.
Why did they think that?
They're Whigs. It's interesting. Most of the British officer class thought that the American war was a huge mistake. A lot of them had fought in the French and Indian War. Their older brother, the Howe's older brother, was killed at Ticonderoga during the French and Indian War, and the Americans established a fund in his honor and a what do you call it, some sort of plaque at Westminster. So they really liked the Americans, and they fought with them. And so why did they do this? You know, why did they accept the command? Because they thought they had a chance to end the war peacefully. It was more important to them that they were there as peace negotiators. Now, this is really the classic example of the iron fist and the velvet glove, to be sure. But they have them trapped on Long Island in the first battle, and the Americans have about 15,000 troops there. Some of them still are on Manhattan, but they've lost the Battle of Long Island, and they've lost several thousand. And the British don't attack them. And Howe says it would have been a frontal attack, would have cost me a lot of troops. Where are they going to go? Well, they sneak across the East River at night. It's one of the great tactical moves by any general in any American war. It is Dunkirk squared. And it's a miracle. Everything has to happen right. The river currents have to be right. The weather has to be right. The fog has to descend at exactly the right moment. And the British have to be paying attention to other things. And they get all of them across. It's like, if you think about it, and there's no great picture of this because the press doesn't report it, because the press is doesn't want to report a defeat. Right. The American press. But if they hadn't got across and they had been trapped and either annihilated or captured, what would have happened? I mean, it would have been a real test for the commitment. I think in the end, it would have made a difference in how the war played out, but it wouldn't have made a difference in the outcome. Right. I think that they were going to, that this was an unnecessary and unwinnable war for the Brits. But good historians disagree on this point, okay? Like the editor of the Washington papers, for obvious reasons, thinks Washington was irreplaceable. Right. If you lose him, there's nobody else to take his place.
When you're ready to make a difference in the world, one law school can make a difference for you. The Massachusetts School of Law is where you learn to become a lawyer. As the most affordable law school in New England, you'll graduate with the most professional skills and the least amount of debt. Our small classes ensure a rich learning experience and a campus environment so special, our students don't want to leave. The Massachusetts School of Law. We're ready to make a difference for you. Visit us today at mslaw.edu.
One of the many things I learned from the book, which I had not known, was that at Bunker Hill, the British bayoneted, after it was all over, the British bayoneted all the wounded who were lying on the hill.
Yeah.
I guess the Americans had left or something?
Well, they retreated off the mountain or off the hill. It's really Breed's Hill, but what happened in Bunker Hill, which is one of the bloodiest battles in the war, and if you notice, Bunker Hill is in June of 1775. It's over a year before that Declaration of Independence. So the war has started 15 months before the political decision is made for independence. Most people don't think about that. The British sent 2,200 troops up the hill. They lose 1,000. They lose almost half their force. When word of this gets back to British in London, a retired British officer was heard to say, "A few more victories like this, and the British Army will be annihilated."
It's called a Pyrrhic victory.
The commander of the lead wave is William Howe, okay? The same guy that's going to command troops in New York and head the army for 2 years in America. Howe is up ahead of his troops. He's got a staff of 5 people walking behind him. He's got a servant with a tray with a jug of brandy on it. He thinks this is going to be a cakewalk. They're just going to run away. Well, every one of his staff is killed. He's never touched. He's like lucky. He's like Washington. Things happen around him, and he doesn't get touched. But it does have a huge impact on him, because one of the reasons that Howe is so cautious in other battles, he's never going to frontally attack an established American position. They're no good in the middle of a field. If you get them in a field in that kind of conventional battle, they'll run away. But if you put them behind bunkers or redoubts or boulders, watch out. They know how to fight that way. But the reason the British bayoneted them, the wounded, and they desecrated the body of James Warren, who was one of the major leaders of the Bunker Hill and of the British. He was up and coming great. And they were so upset at how many of their comrades had been killed. That, they never had that happen to them before. And so the officers couldn't control the men. But you can bet your bottom dollar that the American press used that. And Washington himself said, once that happened, that he had no patience with people who were dilly-dallying about independence. He's now head of the Continental Army by, just about that time. In fact, he's heading from Philadelphia up to Boston when the Battle of Bunker Hill happens. He gets there a little late. But when he sees it, he says, the only thing that we can, the only reason I'm going to head this military force is for independence. You don't fight a war just to negotiate some partial agreement. This is it. He goes all in at that time. And before he's left Mount Vernon and heads up to Philadelphia and then to Boston, he leaves instructions with his manager, a guy called Lund Washington, who's his second cousin. He says, when the British come up the Potomac to burn Mount Vernon, not if, but when, I want you to get out my books and Martha, presumably not in that order. And he assumed that in taking the command of the Continental Army, that he was risking everything. So that phrase that Jefferson comes up with at the end of the Declaration, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, that wasn't rhetorical. And He's on the list, as is John Adams and Sam Adams. I don't know about Franklin. He's on the list. We've never seen the list. It's like the Catholic notion of the index. You know, they always talk about the books that are on the index, but I've never seen the index. And but they're on the list to be executed for treason once the British win the war. Right. So they have no reason to compromise. But the level of commitment that requires, and the level of prescience it is in Washington. One of the characteristics of leadership is something, I don't know how you know where history's headed. You anticipate. And Washington knew the war was going to, we didn't know it. We were at war. And this is headed towards open commitment to independence. He knew that 15 months before the country was ready to do it and conducted himself accordingly.
How about Adams? How is it that Adams understood there was going to be no compromising with the British Empire?
It's a good, well, part of it is he's from New England. New England is being occupied as of 1774 after the Coercive Acts. So that the New Englanders are directly experiencing a more coercive form of British imperialism than the other colonies. And so Adams says, I crossed the Rubicon in 1774. No turning back. But then he goes down to Philadelphia, the First and Second Continental Congress, and he realizes he is a minority, and that most of the other representatives are moderates, and they don't want New England to pull them into a war. These crazy people up in New England, they might get us involved in this thing, And in fact, that's what happens in Lexington and Concord. He writes to Abigail, and some of the letters at this time in the 70s to Abigail are really great, and her letters back too. It's funny, we know most about them when they're apart. And this is the time, and she's up in Braintree, he's down in Philadelphia.
You wrote a whole book based on that.
I did. He says, they are all waiting for a Messiah who will never come. And he knows that the diplomatic efforts are going to fail because he knows, meaning he thinks, and he turns out to be right, that the British ministry is not going to accept a more gentle form of control over the colonies.
Which is what after this war, didn't they accept that? And wasn't it the foundation of the empire for the next 150 years?
To some extent, that's true. What they learn out of, some historians disagree about this, but I think they come out of it recognizing that the kind of control they're going to impose in India, especially, that's the big jewel, needs to depend more on Indians and control and not occupying the country fully with British troops because it's impossible. And so that it's a more indirect form of colonial control. In the end, it still has, there's famous, massacres and stuff. But if you think about it, the two largest democracies in the world are both former British colonies, India and the United States. So that, if you had to pick who's going to be your colonial power, you wouldn't pick France, you wouldn't pick Italy, you wouldn't pick Germany, certainly wouldn't pick Spain. You'd pick Britain.
You wouldn't pick Russia or China.
No.
Yeah. Joe, the Continental Army, I don't want to say it was a shambles. That's not the right word.
It was a work in progress.
Okay, why don't you
And that one of the things that I found out that I sort of knew, but I didn't know it as thoroughly and as deeply as I should have, is that the core of the Continental Army, the people that signed up for the duration, not just for one-year tours, were the dregs of American society.
And the enlistment papers said for the duration or something to that effect?
Right. You got a larger pay, larger stipend if you did that. Right. So they're like former indentured servants, ex-slaves, recently arrived Irish immigrants, people like artisans who are out of work. The reason they're there is because they got no place else to go. Yep. The yeoman farmer remains in the militia. Many of the states, colonies come states, pay militia more than they pay people that go in the Continental Army because they want them to stay in the state. They want them, and that very few of the states meet their troop quotas or their money quotas to support the Continental Army. If they wanted to, the Continental Army could have won the war in 2 years because they could have raised 100,000 troops. The population of the country is such that between the ages of 18 and 50, there's easily done. But the states don't want to do that. They're worried about a standing army. So the one way to win the war is to have a big army, but the big army violates the revolutionary principles on which the war is supposed to be fought. Washington lives with this paradox throughout the war. And the average size of the Continental Army at any time is between 12 and 18,000.
Ever since then, or at least ever since the Civil War, we've lived with hugely expanded armies during wartime, which are then reduced dramatically very quickly after wartime.
Right.
Was this outside their experience, or why didn't they think about doing something like that?
Oh, I see. Create a standing army and then just, fold it up like they did after the Civil War.
Exactly.
Because they're really afraid, they've inherited the British fear of a standing army. Like when the Constitutional Convention comes in, all these states suggest additional amendments, like they suggest 124 amendments. About 12 of them are about no standing army. They really are terrified of this. This is a military body that has historically developed political control. It's the Caesar syndrome. It's the Cromwell syndrome. So even if you try to disband it, it's dangerous. The net result is that the Continental Army is kept on short rations, to put it mildly, a budget string. It almost goes out of existence 2 or 3 times during the war because if it's annual enlistments, okay, so like they're at Valley Forge, the enlistments go up, run out, and so like 5,000 guys leave, another 4,000 die in the winter from exposure and starvation, so you've got like 9,000 troops to make up. You got to count on 9,000 guys signing up. It's like a law school trying to figure out what the admissions class is going to be in the next year. And by the time the guys learn to be a soldier, they leave. That's one of the real problems in the Continental Army. But that's what makes this core of veterans really crucial. And over the course of the war, they develop a veteran officer corps. It takes a while. They discover guys like Greene and Knox and Hamilton who become great officers. At the end of the war, they're promised pensions and they never paid. Right. And it has to do with this standing army thing again. We don't like, okay, virtue should be its own reward, and we don't like a permanent military class, even though you're retired and all this kind of stuff. And especially in Connecticut, Massachusetts, the newspapers are, when the guys come back after the war's over, you should think, parades, right? These are the guys that won the war. This was a huge, big deal. Just the opposite. Just the opposite. They were scorned. Their houses were threatened with attack. It's unbelievable because the attitude towards the standing army is so pervasive, especially in New England. And they never got what they were really due in the way of pensions. And it's a disgrace. And Washington, it was just one of the most sad things in his whole life to see this. These were his guys, and these were the guys that, and think about it, he was in there for 7.5 years.
I have read that something like 10% of the Continental Army, not the militias, but what they call the Continental Line, didn't they, was African American. Is that true?
At any given time, it's 8 to 12%. So 10 is a mean, yeah. And they're in integrated units. That's the next time that's going to happen is the Korean War. Yeah. Initially, in the Boston siege in spring of '76, Washington takes command of these militia units that are going to be the core of the Continental Army. And the question is, should we let African Americans in? And the troops from Virginia say no. And Washington says, okay, we don't want to do this. And then he finds out that if they don't do it, they're going to go to the Brits. And he says...
Who were giving people freedom, as I understand.
Yeah, right. Well, down in Virginia, they try to do this. It doesn't work because all the blacks come to the British and then they die of smallpox on ships. Washington sort of reluctantly agrees to admit African Americans into the army. And then, however, as the war progresses and he sees them, he realizes they're really good soldiers. He's also accompanied throughout the war by an African American valet, I guess is the right word, named Billy Lee. And Billy is a black African American he bought in 1768 because the only one that could keep up with him in the fox hunt. And but Billy's with him the whole war. It's funny. There's a few scenes in Trumbull paintings where you see Billy, like in the surrender at Yorktown. He's got a turban on. I don't know why he's got a turban on, but like. And I've read the entire Washington papers because I did a biography of him once. And I swear to heavens, he's invisible. He's the original Invisible Man. And yet he's there. We know he was there. And people, after the war, and after Washington, long after Washington did, they come back to Mount Vernon where he's freed, but he stays there. And he tells them, that's the only thing we know about Billy, what he's reported by these journalists. You know, well, this happened at Monmouth Courthouse, and General Washington did this at that place, and all that kind of stuff. And the role of blacks in the American Revolution that's not just some sort of hyped thing. They were there. Hamilton and another guy called Lawrence, John Lawrence, want to use the war as a lever to free to end slavery. Washington says that's a great idea, but it's not going to work. And they tried in, I think it's South Carolina, they make a promise that if you come, you know, you'll be freed, and and the South Carolina legislation doesn't pass it.
Am I correct, Joe, that Lawrence was the son of another Lawrence whom you mentioned earlier?
Henry Lawrence. Henry Lawrence is South Carolina. He's president at the time of the Continental Congress, and eventually is sent abroad to represent the United States in the peace negotiations. He's the older guy. His son, John Lawrence, is a very, very intriguing fellow who gets killed in the last weeks of the war when the war is basically over. He's killed in an ambush in South Carolina or Georgia. If he hadn't been killed, he would have been a Hamilton. He would have been as significant a figure publicly as Hamilton. Yeah. If Nathaniel Greene dies in 1785 of sunstroke, if he had not died, he would have been he would have been one of the founding fathers. He'd be up there on Mount Rushmore or on the Mall, because he is of that stature. So if you get killed, it makes a difference.
I'm amazed. Sunstroke?
Yeah, sunstroke.
Wow.
He's married to this woman called Katie Greene, who's really the Cleopatra of the American Revolution. Somebody should make a movie about her, too.
Massachusetts School of Law. Legal education that is practical, accessible, affordable, and enjoyable. Offering flexible day and evening classes, full or part-time studies, where candidates are assessed not on the LSAT, but their academic and other accomplishments. Providing more professional skills training than any other law school in New England. Massachusetts School of Law. Visit us at mslaw.edu. Training students to become successful lawyers and advocates, not just legal scholars.
God, great book. I've got to say to the audience, you must read this book. It's Joe's usual brilliant writing. The writing itself is just fantastic. And, you can see from the discussion here that what Joe discusses is intensely interesting and of the essence of the first very, very beginning of American history. So, Joe, thank you.
Larry, thank you again for having me.
And let me say before concluding that we shall once again take up Professor Ellis's book with him in the next installment of Books of Our Time.